Hi, my name is Rob Nixon. I'm a professor in the English department and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. And I'm talking today on the contest over the commons in relation to environmental justice. Now, for 25 years, I've been teaching, writing, thinking about environmental justice. And one of the most gratifying elements of our current moment for me is the movement of environmental justice concerns from the margins of environmentalism towards the center. And this means that we're able to make much stronger connections between environmental health and public health in particular. So, two fundamental precepts of environmental justice are first, the effort to gain wider access for more people to the fundamental goods of life, by which I mean breathable air, drinkable water, safe, relaxing places to walk, parks, beaches, to maintain or achieve a more equitable access to those resources. The second precept of environmental justice, and the flip side of that, is how to redress the unequally distributed environmental harms that certain communities are exposed to disproportionately. So, on the basis of race or class or ethnicity or immigration status, certain communities are likely to be situated in what is sometimes called sacrifice zones, zones where it's clearly unhealthy to live. These could be next to factories spewing effluents. These could be next to incinerators, landfills, and so forth. So that the long-term health impacts of the concentration of harms in some communities as opposed to others is a key issue for environmental justice activists. All of this connects up with the question of the commons, and perhaps the most obvious place to enter into a discussion of the commons is what is by far the most famous piece of writing on the commons, Garrett Hardin's 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. And why this is important is it has played a very important role in the ideology of neoliberal globalization, which has sort of mounted an assault on the idea of the public good and has operated on the assumption that privatization is an unqualified ideal. So, what Hardin argued in his essay was that the freedom in the commons produces ruin for all. And the pivotal example that he uses is that of a common grazing pasture, whereby more and more people graze their cattle on the pasture, and eventually the pasture becomes unusable because of human greed, because nobody is motivated to manage the load of livestock on that particular grazing end. And so the solution to that is then privatization, because people are invested in ownership and therefore will look after that land better. And a pivotal figure that Hardin alludes to is the British writer William Forster Lloyd. In 1833, Lloyd delivered 2 lectures at Oxford University. And one of the points that he makes in those lectures is that in traveling around Britain, he had noticed that on fenced off private lands, the cattle looked healthy and plump and well fed. And on the commonage, cattle looked puny, scrawny, undernourished. And so he concluded from this that people were not careful in managing the commons, and so they ruined the commons for all. And so this became an argument both for Forster Lloyd and for Hardin, an argument for privatization. So what neither Forster Lloyd nor Hardin mentions is that in the decades prior to his observations about the health of these cattle, in the preceding decades, we had wave after wave of enclosure laws in Britain, whereby public land was appropriated and fenced off and privatized. And so what you had was a concentration of land ownership and a shrinking of the commons. So those laws effectively reduced the commons to a considerable degree and stressed out those commons because you had the same number of cattle with less grazing access. So how do these questions play out in the real world today. So Jennifer Price, who was a visiting Barron professor at Princeton a couple of years ago, lives in LA, and she had noticed that in Malibu and other wealthier coastal areas, private homeowners were de facto privatizing many of the public beaches. And how they were doing this was that they were concealing public rights of way, public access paths down to the beach. If people don't know those paths are there, effectively you can privatize the beach. What she noticed was that people were putting up hedges, vines, gates, fake garage facades, obscuring these paths. And so she produced an app that mapped out all of the legal pathways and encouraged people to actively walk these pathways and to photograph instances and expose instances of landowners who were trying to seal off the beaches. Okay, so that's one example of an initiative trying to protect the commons. It's also valuable to remember that in different historical periods and different societies, the relationship between private ownership and public ownership is configured in many different ways. So, for instance, I've been walking in Scotland and in Sweden, and what's very interesting there is effectively it's much harder to trespass than it is in the US. In Scotland, they have something called the right to roam, which means that anybody can cross private property, and the owners have only limited resources in terms of keeping people off their property. Now, again, there's a kind of a gray zone between the private and the public, but there are protocols managing how you need to behave on that property. So you cannot enter somebody's house. I think in Sweden, you have to stay 100 yards away from the house. You can't go trampling across a cornfield. So there are certain arrangements to the benefit of the access granted to the regular public, and at the same time attempting to prevent destruction of the private property. Now, in France, dating back to the 16th century, they have a practice called gleaning that is instituted by law. And in the context of gleaning, after the harvest is completed on a farm, so it could be an apple orchard, it could be a vineyard, potato farm, a wheat farm. Once the harvest is completed, in the ensuing days, it could be a few days, it could be a week, the general public can access those farms and pick what remains. So it could be fallen apples or grapes or potatoes that the harvester missed, and they can legally access those farms. So in a certain sense, there's a brief season where privately owned farms become a sort of commonage, and then that is closed down. And again, there are protocols. You can't break the branches of the apple tree and so forth. So there are efforts to balance accessibility with protection of the property. So I've talked a little bit about the commons in relation to land, and I wanted to move on to the second part of the talk, which is focusing on the question of breathing room, of air quality as an environmental justice issue, and the air as a absolutely fundamental commons that we all depend on. Now, this image may look unexceptional in the era of COVID, mass bicyclists in Beijing, but in fact, it was taken 10 years ago. And given the appalling air quality in Beijing, there have been a series of very vocal protests against the degradation of that essential commons. Chai Jing, a filmmaker in China in, I think, 2015, made a documentary called Under the Dome. And the dome in question is the perpetually grey sky that hangs over many Chinese cities. And she made this film because she was concerned that her daughter would grow up and never see a blue sky. And so this film was watched by 150 million Chinese people in 2 weeks before the authorities shut it down. And it points to another aspect of environmental justice, which is intergenerational justice. What kind of commonage are we bequeathing to younger generations? What kind of ancestors do we want to be in relation to the state of the commons that we are passing down to young people? And so it's not surprising that in China, young people have been the most active and the most vocal in protesting the environmental burdens of polluted air. And so in these images, we see a marriage ceremony conducted with breathing masks. In the second image, we have an image of two young activists sealed behind plastic and with an X over their mouths. And this is a reminder that the mouth is both a breathing apparatus and it's also the aperture through which we speak and protest. And so the X over the mouth is a very economic way of signifying both a physiological trauma and a trauma of speech in relation to an authoritarian government. So all of this clearly loops back to the question of the movement, Black Lives Matter movement and We Can't Breathe, that was kicked off by the killing of Eric Garner in 2012, where 11 times he said, "I can't breathe." And he was an asthmatic who was in a chokehold, put in a chokehold. And then, of course, George Floyd last year. And so this question of environmental justice in relation to Black Lives Matter movement becomes absolutely critical, because breathing is so fundamental to being human that it's not surprising that in English we have so many figurative ways of referring to that. Somebody will say, I need more breathing room. Somebody sucks all the oxygen out the room. In the case of this cartoon, the reference is to Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." And so yearning to breathe free has been crossed out in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's not surprising to me that this meme, "We Can't Breathe," has resonated across the world. Here's a cover from an Indian magazine, "I Can't Breathe," referring to the terrible air quality in Delhi in the summer, when you have diesel generators, you have car fumes, you have stubble fields around the city burning, you have fireworks displays for Diwali. There are many contributing factors. And again, the health hazards are unequally imposed on the wealthy and the poor. And then this final image is of something that a street artist put up on a wall in Cape Town, "I Can't Breathe." And what's so resonant about this is that the highway that links the airport and the city center, down which tourists pour, is lined by informal settlements. And so to obscure these so-called eyesores of informal settlements, the local government erected these big walls. And so "I Can't Breathe" here has a physiological dimension from the traffic fumes, and also there's a big coal-fired plant just next to the settlements. But it also has this other metaphoric dimension that the poor, as in many parts of the world, are brutally policed and they are living in overcrowded circumstances. So both at a physiological and a metaphoric level, you can understand why poor communities around the world have really taken up this cry. So to come back finally to Hardin's essay, "The Tragedy of the Commons," in most societies, whether these are indigenous societies, peasant communities, or others, the commons has always existed within a context of protocols and restraints. In other words, it's not a free-for-all where people can just pile in and be as greedy as possible. But there are certain regulations, certain controls that seek to maintain the commons for future generations. The commons involve a set of sustainable practices. Now, clearly, in many instances, these have been imperfectly maintained or imperfectly pursued. But contrary to Hardin's argument, the commons is not just an open, unmanaged space. And indeed, towards the end of his life, Hardin acknowledged this, and he said he wished that he had called his essay "The Tragedy of the Unregulated Commons," which has a very different set of implications. And unfortunately, the horse had bolted the barn, and the meme, "The Tragedy of the Commons," the assumption that the commons would result in economic failure, had taken off, and the Chicago School of Economics and many other neoliberal think tanks had jumped on it and mobilized it in the name of the supposed universally more efficient systems of privatization. Thank you.